Alright, this is for 4th grade ELA. This is the text 3, empathy. The essential question is, why is it important to try to understand the feelings of others? Our read aloud goal for today is to recognize causes and effects in the experiences of Doc K. What would you think if I told you about a horse that could spell, count, and do math? Would you believe me? What if the horse won spelling bees against school children? What if I told you that this was a real horse that lived more than 100 years ago? The book I will read you today is about a man who loved animals. Through kindness and patience, he taught a horse to write, count, and make change. The book is Step Right Up, How Doc and Jim K. Taught the World About Kindness by Donna Janelle Bowman. Spring 1889 stretched a blanket of wildflowers over Shelbyville, Tennessee, but William Doc K. barely noticed. He paced and fidgeted like an expectant father. He had been on hand for plenty of births before, but this one was special. Visions of a future champion racehorse darted through his mind as he comforted his mare, Loretta. Finally, a dark, wet colt lay shivering at her side. Doc knelt to welcome the little fellow, but something was terribly wrong. "He is the most spiny, shaky-legged animal I ever did see," he said. Folks would have given up on the colt right then, but Doc had a kind streak that ran clear through his heart and all the way back to his childhood. William K. was born into slavery in 1833. As a child in Shelbyville, he was full of questions about the world. In some parts of the United States, educating an enslaved person was a crime, even where it was not forbidden. Many owners did not want their enslaved peoples to be educated. But John and Martha K., William's masters, like several others in Shelbyville, thought differently. So the K's allowed William to join their sons for lessons. Learning gave William a sense of freedom. So the author says that learning gave William a sense of freedom. What does that mean to you? From the time William was about 6 years old, it was clear he had a special way with animals. No matter how wild or rascally the animals, William befriended them and tamed them. He especially loved horses. A few years later, William's master started sending him across Bedford County to work with other farmers' orny animals. During these travels, William saw how some animals were neglected, beaten, or worked to death. He was gentle and patient with them instead. He thought nothing was worse than being hurtful. William learned all he could about caring for the injuries and illnesses of animals and people. He paid special attention when his mother taught him how to distill roots and herbs into homemade remedies. As William worked at different farms and businesses, his doctoring skills developed, and his reputation grew across Tennessee. By the time he was a young man, William was so good at treating injuries and ailments that everyone started calling him Doc Key, or just Doc. In 1865, the Civil War ended and Doc built a new life as a free man. He married and bought his first patch of land in Shelbyville. It was the perfect spot to build his new horse hospital. Doc also perfected his own line of medicines, including Keystone liniment, which could be used to treat both horses and people. After the war, many formerly enslaved people faced racism and prejudice from white people who would not recognize them as equals. Doc decided that the best way to beat the prejudice he encountered was to try and make friends with everyone and show them he could be a successful businessman. He eventually opened a blacksmith shop, a wagon wheel and harness making shop, a restaurant, and a hotel. He even built a racetrack and dreamed of racing fine racehorses of his own. Doc's Keystone liniment became so popular that he bought a medicine wagon, hired entertainers, and hit the road. He sold his medicines in towns across the South. Soon, Doc was one of the wealthiest men in Shelbyville. So prejudice is an important word on this page. It means an unfair, negative opinion about people without knowing them. One day, as Doc and his wagon clattered through a dusty town, he heard about a rundown circus in Tupelo, Mississippi, that was trying to sell its horses. As he neared the ragtag circus, Doc spotted a scrawny gray mare. She looked neglected and abused, and she walked with a limp. Despite her sad condition, Doc recognized that the mare was a purebred Arabian, a horse bred prized for its intelligence and speed. Doc bought the horse named Loretta for $40 and welcomed her into his family. Doc lovingly nursed Loretta back to health. When she was strong again, he paired her with one of the fastest racing stallions in the country. Doc hoped their offspring would grow up to be a champion racehorse. But on that spring day in 1889, the sight of the sickly colt almost broke Doc's heart. In an instant, Doc's racing dreams for the newborn horse vanished. For weeks, the young horse could barely walk. Friends urged Doc to put the colt out of his misery, but Doc wouldn't listen. Just as he had nursed Loretta back to health, Doc vowed to help her colt. He dished out just the right food and medicines. He massaged the colt's knobbly legs, groomed his scraggly coat, and mulled over the perfect name to give him. The biblical name Doc had chosen for a racehorse didn't fit the wobbly youngster, so Doc just called him Jim. Jim K. Under Doc's care, Jim's health improved and his curiosity grew. Jim seemed to study Doc's every move, even when Doc played with his dog. Then one day, Jim zigzagged over with a stick dangling with his mouth. Doc laughed and tossed the stick away. Jim stumbled after it like a clumsy dog. He was a knowing colt, I tell you, Doc said. He showed me he could fetch and proceeded to try to do the other tricks the dogs could do. Jim learned to sit, play dead, act sick, and roll over on cue. When Jim was about a year old, Loretta died. Doc was heartbroken, but he also worried about Jim. The orphan colt needed looking after night and day, so Doc coaxed Jim up the porch steps and through the front door of his house. The young horse had made himself right at home. So after Jim's mother died, Doc let the colt live in the house with him. Do you think that was a good idea? When Doc counted money, Jim watched. When Doc wrote letters, Jim watched. When Doc opened and closed drawers, Jim watched. Pretty soon he began to pick at me, trying to imitate me, Doc said. It's time. Jim's legs straightened and he muscled up. He grew into a handsome young stallion, and too big for the house. Doc knew it was time for his four-legged house guests to move back to the stable, but Jim kicked up a mighty ruckus until Doc started sleeping on a cot next to Jim's stall. Then Doc moved in his desk and most of his office. Before long, he was practically living in the stable with Jim. When Doc was ready to hitch up the medicine wagon again, he decided to bring Jim along as his newest attraction. Doc held up a bottle of Keystone Liniment and announced for people to gather around. He told the crowd how his sickly, crippled colt had grown strong and healthy. Right on cue, Jim pretended to be sick. He limped and drooped and snorted and wobbled. Then Doc gave Jim a spoonful of medicine and massaged a dollop of liniment into his legs. Suddenly, Jim acted well again. He pranced around, frisky as a pup. The audience clapped and laughed and lined up to buy Doc's medicines. Back at home one day, Doc's wife walked into the stable, munching on a snack. "Jim, do you want a piece of apple?" she asked. Jim nodded his head up and down. Miss Kay ran back to the house, calling, "Doctor, doctor, the horse can say yes." Doc began to wonder what else his horse could learn. "Doc, doc, the horse can say yes." Doc began to wonder what else this horse could learn. The stable was transformed into a horse-side classroom. Doc painted sugar on a cardboard square marked with the letter A and held it up to Jim. A, Doc said. Jim swiveled his ears and listened. Then he licked the card until it was soggy. Doc created a new card out of tin. Every day he patiently repeated A, as he slipped the card between Jim's lips. For weeks Jim just licked the sugar and stared blankly at his teacher. Doc sighed and shook his head, but kept at it. After 6 months, Jim finally understood. If Doc called for the letter A, Jim grabbed the right card and dropped it into Doc's hand. In no time, Jim learned to fetch the B card, then the C card, then all the way to the Z card. Doc was proud. He rewarded Jim with an apple or sugar cubes for each correct answer. Next, Doc had Jim combine letters to spell words, choose numbers to make sums, find flags to identify states, move clock hands to tell time, and a whole lot more. When it's time for Jim to learn to write, Doc pointed Jim's name with sugar on a blackboard. It took months for the horse to learn to lick the pattern of his name. Then Doc slipped some chalk between Jim's teeth so the horse could write his name. The chalk crumbled. They needed a bigger piece. 7 years passed quickly in Jim's private classroom. The more kindness Doc heaped on Jim, the more willing the horse was to learn. Doc was now ready to show the world what Jim could do. Their chance came in 1897 at the Tennessee Centennial Exposition, a huge fair held in Nashville. Doc Key had been asked to help plan a building where African Americans could showcase their art, culture, and inventions. Doc asked the fair directors if he could exhibit Jim. At first, the directors laughed. A horse that could read, spell, write, and do sums. Ridiculous. But as one of the organizers of the fair, Doc insisted that Jim have a stage of his own. Soon, visitors were strolling past the giant seesaw and past Edison's new moving picture machine to see Jim. Throughout the fairgrounds, people chattered about the remarkable educated horse. During one special show, Doc greeted the packed crowd, then turned to Jim. "Jim, can you show me where President McKinley sits today?" Doc asked. Jim strutted to center stage, faced the President of the United States, and bowed. Then Jim walked over to the cards rack, scanned the name cards, and picked up the one marked McKinley. A gasp echoed through the room. Audience members began shouting out requests for Jim. "Spell this word. Divide this number. Get that card. File that letter. Ring up that sale." Jim did it all without a mistake. Even wrote his name on the blackboard, Jim K. People couldn't believe their eyes. How could a horse learn to do such things? The whip makes horses stubborn, and they obey through fear. Doc explained, kindness, and more kindness. That's the way. So does it surprise you that a horse would be able to do all these things? Do you think it was a trick? After the Tennessee Centennial Exposition, Doc and Jim went on the road again. This time they had a big-time promoter, Albert Rogers, to arrange performances for them. News of Jim's remarkable skills spread across the country. Admiring Pete, reporters began calling the horse Beautiful Jim Key. The name stuck. Doc and Beautiful Jim Key performed around the country, but the farther south they traveled, the more racial discrimination Doc faced. Often he wasn't asked to eat in the same restaurants, sleep in the same hotels, or ride in the same railroad cars as white people. Sometimes Doc and Jim weren't allowed to perform because people didn't believe Doc's claims of his horse skills. When Doc offered to perform for schools in Cincinnati, Ohio, a school board member replied, "We can't close our schools for horse shows." And people who didn't know about Doc's gentle training methods worried that Jim might be an abused horse performing out of fear. After a while, Doc and Jim caught the attention of Humane Society groups of people who were committed to ending cruelty toward animals. Like Doc, members of the Humane Societies believed that animals were intelligent, capable of emotions, and willing to learn if treated well. They deserved protection. Beautiful Jim Key was the perfect animal to represent their cause. A portion of the ticket sales for Jim's performances were donated to the Humane Societies. The money was used to buy horse ambulances and rescue cranes, fund educational programs, and buy books about animals for libraries. With their growing fame, Doc and Jim were helped to promote the cause of kindness toward animals. So Doc donated a portion of the ticket sales for his and Jim's performances to Humane Societies. The Humane Societies still exist today. Why do you think Doc thought it was important to do so?